March 10th, 1945. 2 o'clock. Above Tokyo, Japan, the night sky was not black anymore. It had turned orange beneath the bellies of the B-29 superfortresses, a boiling sheet of flame that spread street by street through the wooden neighborhoods below. From 5,000 feet, the city looked less like a capital than a furnace with roads. Pilots could smell it even inside their aircraft. Smoke seeped into the cold metal compartments. Heat rose in violent columns, slamming into the wings, lifting the bombers as if some invisible hand under Tokyo was trying to throw them back into the clouds. Major General Curtis LeMay had changed the war in a single order. No more high-altitude precision bombing through jet stream winds that scattered bombs across empty ground. No more pretending that Japan's factories could be separated neatly from the houses around them. The new target was the urban web itself. Workshops, machine sheds, warehouses, railway yards, family homes, and the narrow lanes that tied them all together. The weapon was fire. The B-29 crews had come from the Marianas, from the long runways on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Their bomb bays carried incendiaries, small cylinders built to punch through roofs and spit burning gel into rooms where paper screens, tatami mats, timber beams, and cooking charcoal waited like kindling. Some crews had stripped guns from their aircraft to carry more bombs. They flew lower than they had been trained to fly, into darkness, turbulence, and the uncertain reach of Japanese fighters. Below them, Tokyo was waking into terror. A mother in Fukagawa heard the first heavy drone roll across the sky and gathered her children before the sirens had finished rising. An old man opened his door and saw sparks moving sideways in the wind, as if the stars had fallen and learned to crawl. Firemen dragged hoses into streets already too hot to stand in. Buckets passed from hand to hand. Police shouted orders that vanished beneath the roar. Then the separate fires joined. Air rushed toward the burning districts so violently that people stumbled as if caught in a storm. Roofs burst, clothes ignited, canals filled with bodies and steam. This was not the first American attack on Japan, but it was something different in scale and intention. On March 1st, only days before the inferno, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had addressed Congress after returning from Yalta. He was frail, seated as he spoke, but his voice still carried the hard rhythm of command. He told Americans that the Japanese warlords had felt the force of the B-29s and carrier planes, and he warned that they knew what was waiting for the Japanese homeland as American bases moved closer. He added that the country must not relax, because, in his words, we haven't won the wars yet. That sentence hung over the Pacific like a verdict. Roosevelt did not describe burning neighborhoods. He did not name the children who would run through smoke or the old women who would vanish in canals. His language belonged to strategy, endurance, and unconditional surrender. To him, Japan remained a militarized empire that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered across Asia, brutalized prisoners, and refused to yield. The road to Tokyo, he told Congress, was still long and costly. The defeat of Germany would not end the war. America had to be ready for a hard struggle in the Pacific. Yet while Roosevelt spoke in Washington, the machinery of that struggle was already moving into its final form. The capture of islands across the Central Pacific had placed Japan within range of the new superfortresses. The B-29 had been designed for long distance, high-altitude war, and the Marianas airfields made sustained raids on the Japanese home islands possible. Inside the White House, reports arrived in numbers. Tons dropped, square miles burned, aircraft lost, crews returned, damage assessed. Japan's ability to sustain war measured through steel, transport, aircraft parts, oil stores, dockyards, and morale. The words were cold because the work of command demanded coldness. But beyond every figure was a city where the wind carried sparks into bedrooms, By dawn, Tokyo's eastern wards were fields of ash. The raid known as Operation Meeting House would become one of the deadliest air attacks in history, killing roughly 100,000 people, leaving around 1 million homeless and destroying about 16 square miles of the city. And Roosevelt, hearing what American air power had done, stood by the central demand that had guided Allied policy since Casablanca. Japan must surrender without conditions. No pause, no negotiated escape for the militarists, no easy exit from the war they had begun. To American commanders, the flames over Tokyo were a warning. To Japan's leaders, they were supposed to be proof that the homeland itself was now inside the battlefield. To the civilians below, they were the end of the world arriving before sunrise. March 1945. Washington, D.K. In the Oval Office, the war arrived as paper. Dispatches crossed Roosevelt's desk in folders and cables, each one trimmed into language that could be read quickly by a dying president who still carried the weight of 2 oceans. The ink spoke of aircraft dispatched, bombs released, enemy resistance, industrial damage, civilian panic, weather conditions, and projected results. It did not smell of smoke. It did not show a handprint burned into a street. It did not carry the sound of Tokyo's canals hissing beneath a storm of sparks. Roosevelt sat behind the desk with a body that had grown thin and exhausted, but his mind remained fixed on the end of the war. Around him stood men who had learned how to speak in the hard vocabulary of total conflict. Admiral William D. Leahy, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander of the Navy's Global War, Henry Stimson, the old Secretary of War. They brought maps, production figures, casualty estimates, invasion studies, and intelligence summaries that pointed toward the same grim conclusion. Japan was being pushed backward, but Japan was not yet broken. The Philippines campaign was still bleeding. Iwo Jima, a black volcanic island 8 square miles across, had become a charnel ground. Marines had clawed their way through ash, tunnels, pillboxes, and machine gun fire to seize airfields that could serve damaged B-29s returning from Japan. The American flag on Mount Suribachi had given the country an image of victory, but the island was still killing men after the photograph was taken. Every yard of rock had required blood. Roosevelt understood what that meant. If Iwo Jima cost so much, what would Kyushu cost? What would Honshu cost? What would Tokyo itself demand if American troops had to fight through streets, hills, caves, factories, and villages against soldiers trained to die rather than surrender? That question shaped everything. When Roosevelt spoke publicly, he did not speak like a man uncertain of the enemy. He called the rulers of Japan militarists, aggressors, warlords. He placed them in the same moral frame as Nazi Germany, not because their systems were identical, but because both had forced the world into war by conquest and cruelty. His message to Americans was simple and repeated with iron control. The war would end only when the enemy's power to resist had been destroyed. Unconditional surrender was more than a phrase. It was a wall. It told Japan there would be no bargain that allowed the empire to keep what it had seized. It told the American public that the dead at Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, and Iwo Jima had not died for compromise. It told Allied commanders that every campaign, naval blockade, submarine patrol, carrier strike, and bomber raid pointed toward one final result. But to reach that result, the United States had to strike Japan where the war lived. The planners in Washington and the Marianas did not see Japanese cities only as cities. They saw dispersed industry. Small workshops made parts for aircraft, radios, weapons, engines, uniforms, and military equipment. A house could also be a production room. A neighborhood could be part of a war plant. Rail lines, power stations, Canals, warehouses, dockyards, and arsenals were folded into civilian life so tightly that the line between factory and home grew blurred in the eyes of the bomber command. This was the logic presented to Roosevelt and his advisors. The enemy's war machine was not hidden behind one wall. It was spread through the urban body. To weaken it, the urban body had to be burned. Still, there was a silence inside the official words. No president at war could stand before the public and say that the path to victory now ran through firestorms. Roosevelt did not tell Americans to imagine the smell of burning cedar, futons, hair, cooking oil, and flesh rising into the night. He did not ask them to picture Japanese families trapped in alleys while B-29s turned away for home. He spoke instead of resolve. He spoke of pressure. He spoke of finishing the job, and millions of Americans, exhausted by rationing, telegrams, casualty lists, and years of war news, listened with grim approval. They remembered December 7th, 1941. They remembered battleships burning in Pearl Harbor. They remembered photographs of prisoners starved and beaten. They remembered news of massacres, forced labor, and island garrisons that fought to the last man. Many did not ask whether Japanese cities should burn. They asked how soon the burning would make Japan quit. Roosevelt's answer was never sentimental. His answer was that the United States would continue to strike. The bombers would keep flying. The blockade would tighten. The fleet would move closer. The soldiers and Marines would prepare for the invasion that everyone feared and no one yet knew how to avoid. In Tokyo, survivors dug through ash for bowls, bones, coins, and family names. In Washington, the president looked toward the map and saw not one burned city, but the remaining distance to surrender. March 1945. The Mariana Islands. The crews did not sleep as men sleep in peace. They slept in fragments, in tents and huts on islands that had been torn from Japan's defensive ring only months before. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Names that had once meant distance on a naval chart had become launch pads for a new kind of war. Around them, the airfield stretched white and hard under the tropical sun, crowded with fuel trucks, bomb trailers, mechanics, armorers, jeeps, ambulances, and the silver bodies of B-29s waiting in rows. The superfortress looked almost too large to belong on the ground. Its wings seemed built for another age, another kind of empire. Men moved under it like insects beneath a bridge, checking tires, oil, engines, turrets, oxygen systems, radios, radar, bomb racks, and fuel lines. Crew chiefs ran their hands across metal skin patched by flak and stress. Armorers lifted incendiary clusters into the bomb bays. Each cylinder had a purpose. Each casing had been designed in laboratories and factories far from the smell of burning cities. For the airmen, the mission began long before takeoff. In briefing rooms, officers pulled covers from maps of Japan. Red circles marked targets: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Kawasaki, Yokohama, Tokyo again. The names were spoken with the calm rhythm of men discussing weather, fuel, altitude, and approach routes. Intelligence officers explained what each city contained: aircraft factories, engine plants, shipyards, rail junctions, warehouses, small subcontractor districts, dense wooden housing, fire breaks, waterways, barracks, power stations. Then came the photographs. Black and white images taken from reconnaissance aircraft lay on tables under bare lights. City blocks appeared as pale rectangles and thin lines. A canal became a silver scar. A schoolyard became an open space useful for navigation. A temple roof became a reference point. A neighborhood of families became target sector D or E or F. Young pilots studied the photographs and tried not to look too long. They had already flown through enough danger to know the sky was not empty. Japan still had fighters. Japan still had anti-aircraft guns. Searchlights could trap a bomber in white glare. Engines could fail over thousands of miles of ocean. A navigational error could turn fuel calculations into a death sentence. A damaged B-29 might ditch in darkness, leaving men in rubber rafts beneath a sky that gave no promise of rescue. Yet the greatest danger on the March raids was not always Japanese fire. It was the weather made by the burning cities themselves. When the bombers crossed the coast and descended toward their targets, crews saw darkness broken by the first marker fires, then more fires, then streets glowing, then entire districts moving like molten cloth. Heat columns punched upward, shaking aircraft hard enough to knock men from their positions. Pilots fought the controls while bombardiers released their loads through smoke so thick that aiming points vanished. Some men saw rooftops peel open below. Some saw rivers reflecting fire from bank to bank. Some saw human movement in the streets and looked away because there was nothing useful they could do with that knowledge. In the official language, they were attacking industrial capacity. In the nose of a B-29, it looked like burning the world. Roosevelt remained at the center of the war's public voice. But by this stage, the machinery no longer needed him to describe every turn of the wheel. He had approved the broader strategy of forcing Japan into collapse by every available means. His commanders understood the political command clearly. The enemy must surrender unconditionally. The sooner Japan's leaders accepted that, the sooner the killing would stop. Until then, the pressure would increase. American newspapers carried reports of the raids in language that transformed flame into progress. Square miles destroyed. War production crippled. Enemy morale shaken. Large fires visible for miles. Results believed excellent. To readers at breakfast tables in Ohio, Texas, California, and New York, Japanese cities were not places they had walked. They were names tied to a war map and to the sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers still in uniform. Many families read the news with a private calculation. Every bomb dropped on Japan might mean one less beach to storm. Every factory burned might mean one less fighter attacking American ships. Every night of fire might shorten the war by a day, a week, a month. It was a brutal arithmetic. But it was the arithmetic of 1945. Roosevelt's words lived inside that arithmetic. When he warned that America had not yet won the war, he was asking the country to accept what still had to be done. He did not celebrate suffering for its own sake. He did not need to. The strategy depended on convincing Japan's rulers that suffering would grow beyond endurance. The bombers were not merely destroying machines. They were carrying a message written in fire. No city was beyond reach. No factory district was safe. No night would guarantee sleep. The empire had begun the war by expanding violence across Asia and the Pacific. Now violence had reached the wooden heart of the empire itself. In Tokyo, the dead had not yet all been counted when other cities began to hear the engines. Nagoya felt the bombers overhead. Osaka watched flames leap through industrial districts and crowded neighborhoods. Kobe burned along its port and hillsides. Each raid added another entry to the ledger. Each returning crew carried another memory that could not fit into a report. A turret gunner remembered the strange beauty of sparks rising higher than his aircraft. A radio operator remembered praying for altitude as heat threw the plane upward. A pilot remembered the silence in the cockpit after the target disappeared behind smoke. On the ground in Japan, civilians learned to fear the sound before the siren. Children were trained to run with padded hoods and emergency bags. Families dug shelters that could not survive a firestorm. Neighborhood associations prepared buckets, sand, hooks, and hand pumps against weapons designed to create hundreds of fires at once. Officials told the people to stand firm. Newspapers insisted that sacrifice would defeat the enemy's cruel attacks. Military leaders continued to speak of decisive battle, spiritual strength, and the sacred duty to protect the homeland. But every burned district weakened the lie. The emperor's cities were vulnerable. The army could not shield them. The navy could not stop the bombers. The great defensive perimeter had cracked, and through that crack came engines in the night, again and again. Roosevelt did not live to see where this road would end. But in March 1945, as fires spread from city to city, his demand still governed the American war. No negotiated peace, no partial settlement, no return to the world before Pearl Harbor. Japan's war power had to be crushed so completely that surrender became the only path left. And above the Pacific, the B-29s kept turning toward the homeland, their bomb bays full, their crews silent, their course set by a decision already made. April 1945. Warm Springs, Georgia. The president had gone south with the war still unfinished. At Warm Springs, the air was softer than Washington's. Pine trees stood beyond the windows, and the Georgia hills carried the quiet of a place built for rest. But there was no true rest for Franklin D. Roosevelt, even here, far from the capital's marble rooms and crowded corridors. The war followed him in dispatch boxes, memoranda, coded messages, newspapers, and the faces of men who knew that every hour might bring news from Europe, the Pacific, or both. He was 63 years old, but he looked older. The burden of 4 elections, depression, global war, and illness had carved itself into his body. His cheeks had hollowed. His hands seemed thinner. Those close to him could see fatigue even when he smiled. Yet he remained president, commander-in-chief, the public voice of a country that had crossed from shock into vengeance, from vengeance into endurance, and from endurance into the final violent work of victory. In Europe, Nazi Germany was collapsing. American and British armies drove eastward. Soviet armies pressed from the other direction with terrible force. Town after town fell. Prison camps opened before stunned soldiers. The Reich, that had promised 1,000 years, was being crushed in less than 13. But the Pacific was not ending with Europe. Roosevelt knew it. Every advisor knew it. The American public knew it too, even if they hoped otherwise. Japan still held millions of men under arms across Asia and the home islands. Its leaders still spoke of honor and resistance. Its commanders still prepared for invasion. Its soldiers had shown on island after island that surrender was rare and death was expected. The fire raids were part of that final pressure. Reports continued to reach the president. Tokyo had burned. Nagoya had burned. Osaka had burned. Kobe had burned. The air campaign was widening, and each attack was measured not only in destruction, but in possibility. Could Japan's aircraft industry be weakened enough to reduce resistance to invasion? Could transportation be broken? Could morale crack? Could the shock of burning cities force the men in Tokyo's military councils to accept what Roosevelt had demanded since 1943? Unconditional surrender. Those 2 words had become the gate through which the war had to pass. At Warm Springs, Roosevelt could not see the faces of Japanese civilians, but he could see the faces of American casualties in the reports from Iwo Jima. He could imagine the telegrams sent to farms, apartments, factory towns, fishing villages, and city blocks across the United States. He could see the cost of every island on the road to Japan, Tarawa's beaches, Saipan's cliffs, Peleliu's ridges, Leyte's mud, Iwo Jima's ash. Soon Okinawa's coral hills would add another name to the list. For Roosevelt, the central question was not whether the war had become merciless. It had been merciless for years. The question was how to end it without leaving the Japanese war machine alive to rise again. In the quiet rooms of Warm Springs, that question weighed more heavily than any speech. He had spoken often of future peace. He had imagined a world organization strong enough to prevent another catastrophe. He had placed hope in the United Nations before the name fully existed as an institution. He believed that victory had to be followed by order, that military defeat had to be followed by a political structure capable of holding the peace. But before that future could be built, the Axis powers had to be defeated completely. And so there was no softening in his public demand. No message went out telling the bombers to stop. No address announced regret for Tokyo. No public statement separated Japanese civilians from the empire's military rulers in a way that changed the campaign. The president's silence on the human suffering below the bombers was not accidental. It belonged to the moral atmosphere of total war, where leaders spoke in terms of nations, production, surrender, and victory, while civilians on all sides became exposed to the machinery that those words set loose. Still, Roosevelt was not a man untouched by death. He had led through casualty lists for years. He had written letters to grieving families. He had carried the memory of America's entry into war from the first shock of Pearl Harbor. He had seen Allied nations overrun, cities bombed, ships sunk, prisoners murdered, and whole populations trapped under occupation. In his mind, the responsibility for the Pacific's suffering rested first with the Japanese militarists who had chosen conquest and refused to surrender. That belief hardened every decision around him. In the Pacific Command, officers did not wait for emotional language from Washington. They understood the meaning of policy. Keep attacking, keep tightening the blockade, keep destroying Japan's capacity to fight. Prepare for the invasion if surrender did not come. Every operation had to serve the ending Roosevelt had demanded. In Japan, the raids produced grief, anger, exhaustion, and fear. But not immediate surrender. The government censored reports, controlled language, and demanded endurance. Families moved through ruins with bundles on their backs. Factory workers were reassigned. Children were evacuated. Soldiers drilled. Officials promised that the enemy could still be defeated once he came ashore. The American bombers returned. Their crews flew through smoke from cities already burned and towards cities not yet touched. On the long over-water flights, men stared at instruments, listened to engines, checked fuel, and thought of home. Some believed the raids were necessary. Some hated the work and did it anyway. Some refused to speak of what they had seen. They were young men inside a machine built by an industrial nation, sent to break another industrial nation before the infantry had to enter it street by street. And behind them, in Georgia, the president's strength was running out. On April 12, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt sat for a portrait at Warm Springs. The artist worked while the president handled papers nearby. Outside, spring light touched the trees. Inside, the war waited in every document. Then Roosevelt raised a hand to his head and said that he had a terrific pain. Within hours, he was dead. The commander-in-chief who had led the United States from Pearl Harbor to the edge of victory would not hear Germany surrender. He would not see Okinawa's full horror. He would not decide how to use the atomic bomb. He would not stand before the nation when Japan finally yielded. But the fire campaign he had allowed and the surrender policy he had insisted upon moved forward without him. April 13th, 1945. Washington, D.C. Harry S. Truman woke into a presidency already surrounded by fire. One day earlier, he had been vice president, a man kept close enough to the office to inherit it, yet far enough from the deepest secrets to be startled by what waited behind the door. Now Roosevelt was gone. The mourning flags were lowered. The country listened in shock. In the White House, the rooms felt both familiar and suddenly foreign, as if every hallway had become part of a battlefield map. Truman had no long apprenticeship in supreme command. He had not shaped the grand strategy from Casablanca to Tehran to Yalta. He had not sat through all the early arguments over unconditional surrender, global logistics, bomber production, Pacific Island campaigns, and Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Yet in a single afternoon, all of it became his responsibility. Europe was almost finished. Germany was collapsing so quickly that maps became outdated within hours. But Japan remained defiant, and the fires over Japanese cities did not pause for American grief. The B-29s kept flying from the Marianas. On the islands, crews heard the news of Roosevelt's death with the strange numbness that war often produced. Some men stood silently by their aircraft. Others read the bulletin and then returned to loading bombs. Mechanics still had engines to service. Armorers still had incendiaries to prepare. Navigators still had charts to mark. The death of a president could shake the nation, but the schedule of war did not dissolve. Orders still moved. Targets still waited. Weather reports still mattered. Fuel still had to be pumped into the wings. Roosevelt's policy did not die with him. Truman inherited it as both instruction and burden. Japan must surrender unconditionally. American forces must continue the offensive. The blockade must tighten. The air raids must intensify. Preparations for invasion must continue because no one could assume that fire alone would force surrender. By spring, Okinawa was proving how terrible that invasion might become. The island lay south of the Japanese home islands, close enough to serve as a base for the final assault. American troops had landed there on April 1st, expecting hard resistance, but the real battle formed inland, where Japanese defenses turned ridges, caves, tombs, ravines, and villages into killing grounds. Rain turned earth to mud. Artillery shattered hillsides. Marines and soldiers advanced yard by yard through fire. Kamikaze pilots crashed into ships offshore, turning decks into flame and steel. Sailors died in burning compartments. Corpsmen crawled through shell bursts. Civilians, trapped between armies, suffered in numbers that would haunt the island long after the guns stopped. To Truman and his commanders, Okinawa was a warning written in blood. If this was the cost of taking one island, what would it cost to land on Kyushu? What would it cost to fight through Japan's home soil, where defenders could draw on prepared positions, civilian labor, hidden aircraft, suicide boats, mines, and a population taught that surrender meant disgrace? Intelligence reports did not give comfort. They suggested that Japan was preparing for a decisive homeland battle, not a negotiated exit. So the bombers became more important. They were the weapon that could strike Japan before invasion. They could burn aircraft parts before they reached assembly. They could cut rail yards before soldiers moved. They could destroy urban districts that fed the military economy. They could carry the psychological message Roosevelt had accepted and Truman continued. The United States was not going to stop at the coastline. The homeland itself would be made to feel the war until its rulers accepted surrender. In Japan, the raids entered daily life like a second climate. People learned the habits of destruction. They slept clothed. They packed emergency bundles. They memorized shelter routes. They watched the sky with tired eyes. Some families sent children away from the cities, only to find that no place felt fully safe. Trains carried evacuees past blackened districts where chimneys rose from ash like cemetery markers. Schools became barracks, clinics, or ruins. Temples sheltered the homeless. Women cooked in open spaces where houses had stood days earlier. The government insisted that endurance was victory. Military police watched for defeatist speech. Newspapers praised sacrifice. Officials urged civilians to fight fires, preserve order, and support production. Yet the physical truth was harder to conceal with each passing raid. Osaka's industrial wards had burned. Kobe's port had burned. Nagoya's aircraft industry had been hit again and again. Tokyo, though already wounded beyond recognition in some districts, remained a target because the war machine still pulsed through the capital's surviving arteries. Truman's public words followed Roosevelt's line. He spoke of carrying forward the work left to him. He promised to prosecute the war with all the power available. He knew that to change course visibly, to soften the demand for unconditional surrender, or to halt the bombing without Japanese concessions would appear to many Americans as weakness at the very moment victory seemed close. And there was another secret now being placed before him. Within days of taking office, Truman learned in full about the weapon being built by the Manhattan Project. Scientists, soldiers, engineers, and laborers had been working in hidden cities and desert sites to create a bomb unlike any weapon used in history. Roosevelt had authorized that vast effort, but he had died before its result could be tested. Truman now stood at the junction of two forms of destruction, one already visible over Japan in the glow of burning cities, the other still unproven, waiting behind fences and guarded gates in New Mexico. But even before the atomic bomb entered the war, Japan was being consumed by conventional fire. The raids spread beyond the largest cities. Medium-sized urban centers, transport hubs, and industrial towns came under attack. The logic was relentless. Every city that contributed to Japan's ability to fight could become a target. Every night brought the possibility of engines overhead. Every warning siren carried the memory of Tokyo. Inside the B-29s, crews were also changing. Combat hardened them, but it did not make them simple. Some joked before takeoff because fear needed a disguise. Some wrote letters home and never mentioned the fires. Some stared at target photos and told themselves they were hitting factories. Some saw the glow below and knew factories were not the only things burning. A bombardier might return from Osaka and eat breakfast in silence. A pilot might write in a diary that the whole city seemed alive with flame. A gunner might remember looking down and feeling both triumph and sickness at the same time. That contradiction was the heart of the campaign. The raids could be militarily effective and morally devastating. They could shorten the war and deepen its horror. They could save American invasion casualties while killing Japanese civilians in vast numbers. Leaders in Washington weighed outcomes at the scale of nations. People on the ground lived the consequences one breath at a time. Roosevelt had not left behind a sentence of pity for the burned cities that changed the course of policy. He had left behind a demand, unconditional surrender. Truman took that demand and carried it into the summer. The bombers lifted again from the Marianas, heavy with fuel and incendiaries. Their engines hammered over the Pacific. Their crews flew toward a dark horizon where the islands of Japan waited under cloud. Moonlight, smoke, and fear. In Washington, a new president learned how quickly decisions could become death for people he would never see. And in the ruins of Japan's cities, survivors began to understand that the fire was not a single disaster. It was a promise that more would come. August 1945. Tokyo, Japan. By the time summer pressed down on the ruined capital, Tokyo no longer looked like a city that had merely been bombed. It looked as if whole districts had been erased from memory and replaced with dust, warped metal, and fields of broken tile. People walked across open ground where streets had once twisted between homes and shops. They moved carefully because the earth still held nails, glass, fragments of pottery, and the remains of lives interrupted too quickly to leave order behind. A woman searched for a cooking pot in the ashes of her neighborhood. A boy carried water past a wall that stood alone. Its house vanished around it. Old men squatted in the shade of makeshift shelters and watched the sky even when no aircraft could be heard. The habit had entered the body. Engines meant danger. Sirens meant movement. A quiet night meant only that fear had been postponed. Japan was starving slowly under blockade and bombardment. Rail lines had been struck. Ports had been mined. Fuel was scarce. Factories lacked parts, power, workers, and time. Families stretched rice with whatever they could find. School children worked in fields and workshops. Soldiers trained for the invasion they were told would decide the fate of the empire. Bamboo spears appeared in civilian drills, not because they could stop tanks, but because the government needed the people to believe that resistance still had meaning. Yet belief was thinning. The fire raids had made the war intimate. It was no longer only in China, Burma, the Philippines, New Guinea, or distant islands with names printed in newspapers. It was in the smell of wet ash after rain. It was in a missing daughter. It was in the absence of a street. It was in the black outline of a kettle fused to a floor that no longer existed. The American message had been delivered again and again from the bomb bays of the B-29s. Surrender or destruction will continue. That message had begun under Roosevelt's authority and survived his death. It had passed from his hands to Truman's, from speeches to orders, from maps to aircraft, from aircraft to cities. Roosevelt had never stood before the nation to say, in plain human terms, that American bombers were burning Japanese civilians in their homes. He spoke instead of the enemy's warlords, of the need for final victory, of the refusal to quit before the wars were won. His words were shaped for a nation at war and for a policy that allowed no compromise with the aggressor states. What did Roosevelt say when American bombers began burning Japanese cities? He said the war was not over. He said Japan's rulers had already felt the weight of American air power. He said the pressure would continue until victory. And behind those measured sentences stood the harder truth. He accepted that the road to surrender would pass through Japan's cities because he believed the alternative was a longer war, an invasion, and still more death on a scale no one could confidently measure. In that belief, Roosevelt was not alone. Many American commanders, officials, and citizens shared it. They looked at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and saw warnings. They looked at kamikaze attacks and saw an enemy willing to spend lives with terrifying determination. They looked at years of Japanese conquest and brutality and concluded that only overwhelming force would end the war. To them, the fire raids were not cruelty for its own sake. They were pressure applied to a state that refused surrender. But history does not let the flames become clean because the argument was strategic. The people under the bombs did not die as symbols. They died as mothers, clerks, students, factory workers, infants, grandparents, nurses, monks, conscripted laborers, shopkeepers, and children too young to know the name of the policy that placed them in the target zone. Their deaths belong to the war, but they also belong to themselves. That is the burden inside Roosevelt's silence. His public language did not linger over civilian suffering because doing so might have weakened the unity required to finish the war. It might have opened questions that leaders did not want asked while sons were still fighting across the Pacific. It might have made Americans look too closely at what total war had made normal. So the official words remained firm and distant. Production, morale, air power, pressure, surrender, victory. Then came August. Hiroshima was destroyed by a single atomic bomb on August 6th. Nagasaki followed on August 9th. Between those blasts, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. The shocks struck the imperial government from every direction. The cities already burned by conventional bombing had shown that Japan could be destroyed piece by piece. The atomic bombs showed that destruction could arrive in one flash. The Soviet attack shattered hopes that Moscow might help mediate a better peace. At last, the wall cracked. On August 15th, Japanese civilians heard the emperor's voice on the radio for the first time. Many could barely understand the formal language, but they understood the meaning as it spread from person to person. The war was ending. The unbearable had to be borne. Surrender had come. Across the Pacific, American families wept, shouted, prayed, and embraced strangers in the streets. Men who had expected to invade Japan realized they might live. Sailors imagined going home. Soldiers stared at the news in disbelief. Mothers held photographs of sons who would not return and wondered why peace had arrived too late for them. Roosevelt was not there to speak. His chair was empty. His voice belonged to recordings, memories, and the earlier years of war. Yet his policy remained present in the final outcome. The insistence on unconditional surrender had shaped the campaign to the end. The bombing of Japanese cities had been part of the pressure that helped bring Japan to collapse. But it left behind a moral landscape as burned and difficult as the physical one. To tell the story honestly, one must hold both truths at once. The fire raids were designed to weaken Japan's ability to continue the war. And they did. They destroyed industry, disrupted transport, shattered cities, and deepened the crisis facing Japan's leaders. They also killed civilians in immense numbers and turned neighborhoods into crematories beneath the night sky. Roosevelt's words did not dwell on that second truth. His words aimed at victory. His words told Americans to continue. His words made clear that the war would not end until Japan submitted. And in the spring of 1945, while Tokyo still smoked and the B-29s prepared for new raids, that was enough for the machinery of war to keep moving. So when you imagine Roosevelt hearing of the burning cities, do not picture a dramatic confession or a moment of public regret. Picture a tired president behind a desk, facing maps covered in arrows and casualty estimates, believing that every terrible pressure brought surrender closer. Picture a leader who saw the enemy state before he saw the individual faces beneath it. Picture the final logic of total war, where victory and devastation traveled in the same aircraft. And then picture Tokyo at dawn. No speeches, no strategy tables, no flags, only smoke rising from the ruins, footsteps in ash, and survivors looking upward at a sky that had become part of the war.